How do we get energy from ATP? So I think in the last pictures, this picture was flipped and the adenosine was over on the other side and the phosphates were on this side, but still the same molecule. So you've got your sugar and your phosphates and your base. And the way that you get energy is by breaking the high energy bonds between the last two phosphate groups in ATP. So typically what you do, whoops, typically what you do is break this bond right here. And so in that case, you're breaking it from ATP with 3 phosphates down to just 2 ADP. And so here you have ATP, you've broken this bond, and what you end up with is ADP plus P. So T is for tri, ATP, and down here you only have 2 phosphates, so it's ADP plus P. And usually we put a little I to show that it's inorganic, it's got no carbon with it. So you can also write it this way, ATP breaks down into ADP plus P. What's the process called? So what you can see here, let's start it from the beginning. You've got ATP with the 3 P's, and you break, it goes too fast, don't you think? So here's ATP, here's water. You break it right here, you put that part of the H2O on here. Go ahead, do it again. And then you have this extra hydrogen here. So you're adding water. So when you add water, if you remember, that's called hydrolysis. Hydro for water, lysis for break. So you're breaking the molecule here, and you're adding water. How does that happen? There's an enzyme, of course. So there are enzymes to catalyze pretty much every reaction in your body, and so that's no different when ATP is involved. And so if you think about what you would call that, it would end with what? ACE. So, whoops. So the enzyme that breaks down ATP is ATPase. And so here's the reaction where you have ATP. You're breaking this bond to make ADP with just 2 P's, plus that extra P goes here. So it's ATPase on this side to break it down. And so another way to write it is to show the whole equation. And a lot of times we write the enzyme name on top of this yield arrow. So ATP with the enzyme around ATPase breaks the P off, so you get ADP and PI. And so how is ATP remade? If you're contracting your muscles and you use up all your ATP, well, my goodness, you've got to make more ATP. So you do that by cellular respiration. And what do you actually do to the ATP, to the ADP to get back ATP? So that's the reverse of what I just showed you a slide ago. And this time you have a different enzyme used. You're making or synthesizing ATP this time. So it's ATP synthetase. So ACE means it's an enzyme, synthesize means to make, and ATP. So this is an enzyme that synthesizes or makes, and you're making ATP. So the energy to do this comes from cellular respiration or fermentation or whatever your molecule is that you're breaking down, whatever process that is. But you always start with these raw materials, ADP. Oops, that's supposed to be D, ADP plus P, and you put these two together using the energy that you got from cellular respiration or whatever to make your ATP. And so here's a picture of the reaction, whoops, going back and forth. And so you've got, let's see if I can erase this stuff so you can see it. Let's get this out of the way because it's kind of making a mess here. Okay, so you've got ATP and water, and you break that down, that's this arrow, and you're making ADP, and you've got an extra phosphate. And so when you break ATP, that's this way, you use ATPase. And when you use energy from cellular respiration or fermentation or whatever process you're using, you take ADP and P, and you put them together, and you make ATP. You use the energy from cellular respiration, and you use the enzyme ATP synthetase. And so cellular respiration or fermentation or another process can do that for you. So you can write it in either direction, but if you have the arrow going this way, that means these are actually your reactants. We have this kind of looking a little backwards, but the key is to look at the arrow. The arrow is going that way. That means in this case you start here. So here are your reactants, and here's your product, ATP. So you've got A with two P's plus a P, and you put them together to make ATP. That's adenosine, and then it's triphosphate, 1, 2, 3. So you take the diphosphate and you stick that on. You do that with two things. You do that with the enzyme ATP synthetase, and you also need energy from breaking down glucose or another molecule. And so here's the ADP-ATP cycle. So remember, when you have ATP and you break it down, you use ATPase. And when you put it back together, you're making ATP. So another word for make is synthesize. So that enzyme is ATP synthetase. So if you have this picture in your notes, you want to write in ATPase here and ATP synthetase here. Certainly pause that if you want to. When is ATP made by living things? During a process called cellular respiration that takes place in both plants and animals. Something like this takes place in all living things. It might be fermentation or another process, but some process where you're breaking down a molecule to release energy and make ATP. And here's the key, one thing that students forget a lot is that plants actually have to do this too. We always think of plants as making glucose because they do. Plants will take carbon dioxide and they'll take water, 6 of each of these, and they'll make glucose with that waste product, oxygen. And I guess you can put the numbers in here too, 6, 6, and 6. So this is photosynthesis. Plants make glucose. But there's no reason in the world to make glucose if you can't then break it down. And when you break it down, you release energy, and you use that energy to make ATP. Whereas this way you use sunlight energy. Okay, quiz time. Yay! Which enzyme catalyzes this reaction? So you have ATP being broken down. That's called ATPase. Ose means it's a sugar, so that wouldn't be it. And ATP synthetase is when you synthesize or make ATP. Which enzyme catalyzes this reaction? Oh, look, now you're making ATP. So that's ATP synthetase. How many phosphate groups does ATP have? Just like a tricycle with 3 wheels, ATP has 3 phosphate groups. When ATP breaks down to ADP, how many phosphate groups are broken off? Whoops, I didn't mean to do that before you could see, but here's the thing. ATP means it's got 3 P's, and then when you make ADP, you've got just 2 phosphate groups, so that means this one has to be the extra one. So there's just one. What directly supplies the activation energy for chemical reactions? ATP. Thank you, ATP. What directly supplies the energy needed for muscle contraction? ATP. What is this reaction called? Oh my goodness. So when you break something down, you're breaking. Another word for breaking is lysis, and you're going to use water for that. So that's this one, hydrolysis. And that is the end of my story. Happy day.